Well, hello everyone, and thanks very much for coming. Welcome to the Centre of Islamic Studies seminar at the University of Cambridge. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Centre, and I'm standing in for our Director, Professor Khalid Fahmy, today. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this, the first talk of the term. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Urban. Dr. Urban is Associate Professor of History at West Chester University of Pennsylvania. She took her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2012 and then spent some time as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow and then joined the Faculty of History at West Chester University in 2014. And her interests include early Islamic history, particularly gender, slavery, and empire. And in 2020, Dr. Urban published a monograph, Conquered Populations in Early Islam, with Edinburgh University Press. And the Association of College and Research Libraries in the United States awarded this book the very prestigious accolade of being the outstanding academic title of 2020. The book focuses on Muslims of slave origins who were both members of their society, but also somewhat alien within it because of their background as slaves. And she looks at how they were integrated into society and their role in the changes that Islamic society underwent as it transformed into an expansive empire. So her talk today is entitled Conquered Populations in Early Islam. And as usual, we will have some time for questions and discussion at the end of the talk. And we'll record the talk, but then we'll switch the recording off for the questions, so you can feel free to be more relaxed. Please ask questions by typing in the chat function, and then we can pick them up that way. So Dr. Urban, we're very honoured to have you here. Thanks very much for coming, and it's over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you all today. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my slides. I hope you are all safe and well at the beginning of this 2022. Today I'll be talking with you about my 2020 monograph, Conquered Populations in Early Islam. If you have already read the monograph, I apologize. Some of this might be a little bit repetitive to you. But for those of you who haven't read it, it will go over some of the main findings. And I've also tried to pitch this talk to be interesting to a wide variety of people, specialists, but also non-specialists as well. So to begin, I study the first 2 centuries approximately of Islamic history, roughly 600 Common Era to 800 Common Era. This is an absolutely foundational period of Islamic history. It witnessed the career of the Prophet Muhammad, the revelation and writing down of the Quran, and the establishment of the first community of believers in Western Arabia. Then it saw the rapid political expansion of a state headed by Muslims and the elaboration of an empire that included things like building roads, taxes, coinage, bureaucracy, law codes, all similar in some ways, and in many cases actually modeled on those empires that preceded it. For example, here's a picture of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, created by the Caliph Abdul Malik of the Marwanid family of the Umayyad dynasty. That's the name of his dynasty, who ruled from 685 to 705 CE, Abdul Malik, the builder of this Dome of the Rock, which is modeled on a kind of Byzantine form of building. And he also reformed the coinage and began having some bureaucratic reforms, translation into Arabic and things like that. And then this imperial building, state building, continued with the Abbasid Caliphs, who overthrew the Umayyads in 750 of the Common Era. The Abbasids are probably the most famous caliphs in the Islamic tradition, and they are mostly later than what I really focus on. But for our purposes today, the most important thing to know about the Abbasids is that it was under the Abbasids, and often with Abbasid patronage, that most of our early Islamic narrative historical sources were written. That is to say, it's mostly sources written during this Abbasid period that go back and tell us about this earlier Umayyad period, and they treat this Umayyad period with some hostility, and that also go back and tell us about this Islamic Origins period, and they look back on this Origins period with reverence. So, long story short, it means that the historian has to be careful not to take these narrative accounts of the past at face value, but to analyze and interpret them carefully. It also means that historians who study that earliest Islamic period need to rely on other kinds of sources. For example, in particular, I focus a lot on the Quran itself as a historical source, because it's widely recognized to be an authentic contemporary document from 7th century Arabia. So it's like a really important historical source. I won't go into too much of the nitty-gritty of the methodologies that I used, but instead I'll tell you, my central animating question behind my research was, how? How did this work? How did Islam transform from a small monotheistic reform movement in Western Arabia into the official doctrine of a cosmopolitan, expansive empire, an imperial tradition? What did that transformation look like? What did it entail? And there's obviously many ways to approach such a big question, but for me, I wanted to approach this question by looking at the people involved, the people who somehow, began outside the Islamic community and came inside it, whether that was through conversion, assimilation, enslavement, and other means. I wanted to know, what did it mean for them to join this growing tradition? What was their identity within that tradition? What did Islam mean for them? How did their joining the Islamic community change them? How did they change the Islamic community? So I was really interested in these people, these kind of liminal people, these people who traversed that boundary between outsider and insider, or who in some senses inhabited kind of a complex or liminal position within the Islamic Ummah itself. And my thinking was, if we can trace the journey of some of these liminal people, we could get a better sense of the broader changes and transformations that are happening in this period. So I decided to focus my research on 3 groups of people, and I'll talk more about each of these. But MAWALI, which is a term I'll talk more about in a moment, essentially means freed slave, non-Arab Muslim, something like that, enslaved women, and the sons of enslaved women. And by looking at these three groups together, I came up with some of the following conclusions. This is an overview, and then I'll go into this in more detail in my talk. 1, it seems to me that the earliest Islamic community was relatively egalitarian. I don't mean to say completely egalitarian, but relatively so, especially when it came to things like ethnic or racial identity, family background, social class, legal status. All of those things seem to have been relatively equalized in the earliest Islamic community, where belonging and piety and faith seem to have been the most important markers of belonging. But as the community expanded into an empire, it came to make the same distinction that countless empires before it made between the conquering elite and the conquered masses. Along the same lines, this second one, ethnogenesis of Arab and non-Arab, I found that Arab and non-Arab are not static, timeless, obvious terms. You can't assume that you know what the term Arab meant to people in the 7th century just because you understand what it means today. These ethnic and national identities change over time depending on historical context. So I'll talk more about how the incorporation of enslaved persons into the Islamic Empire changed the meaning of these terms. Also, enslaved women are crucial to these, everything I'm talking about here, the development of new ethnic ideas, the development of new hierarchies. These women were bearing children to free masters, they were participating in politics, they were creating cultural products such as songs and instrumental music, and all of this had an impact on early Islamic history. And finally, my last point may go without saying to the historians in the room, But I think it's worth saying anyway, which is that early Islamic history is dynamic. It's a period of creativity, change, trial and error, transformation. As a historian, I don't look back on this earliest period to find some essential kernel of what Islam really is, captured, like a little bug captured in amber. I don't think that's how it works as a historian. Instead, I go back to look at this period to understand how early Muslims were grappling with big questions like, what does it mean to be a Muslim? And what does it mean, practically speaking, to be a Muslim? How do you live out your faith in this changing geopolitical and political historical circumstances? And before I go any deeper, I just want to say one last note on slavery and enslavement in the period that I'm discussing. Again, for the historians in the room, this may go without saying, but I think for non-specialists, again, this is quite worth saying, which is, I'll be talking about slavery in the early Islamic period. When I do so, I am not trying to say anything about the essential relationship between Islam and slavery. That is, I'm not trying to say that Islam and slavery necessarily go together or that slavery is a central part of the Islamic tradition. Islam arose in a historical context that practiced slavery. Christians and Jews in late antiquity, and that's 4th to 8th century or so, practiced slavery. The Bible mentions slavery. Roman law codes from around this time mention slavery. So also the Quran mentions slavery, but it does not explicitly encourage it or condone it. It does, in fact, explicitly encourage the manumission, emancipation of slaves. I don't want to get into all the details here, but if you have questions at the end of the talk, I would be happy to talk more about the Quran and what it has to say about slavery. But long story short, I'm not a theologian trying to intervene in questions like, what is Islam's moral stance towards slavery? I'm a historian. And so I think slavery, like all other practices and institutions, need to be understood as part of this historical context. That said, let's delve more into these 3 groups of people that I've mentioned. Let's start with the MAWALI. So those of you who are not specialists might wonder, Professor Urban, is it really necessary to begin a talk with an untranslated Arabic term? Isn't that quite inaccessible to a non-Arabic speaking audience? And to you, I would say, hear me out. The reason I've let this term untranslated is because in Arabic, it has so many different meanings. It is a chameleon of a term, if you will, that I think it's precisely by seeing how it changes its meanings in different contexts that we can see the shifting of broader historical shifts in social identities, for example. So at its heart, MAWALI in Arabic means relatives, friends, supporters, someone with whom you share social bonds in some ways. I argue in the Quran, it comes to mean fellows in faith, that is brothers in faith, people with whom you share social bonds because you are all members of the same religious community together. And for this reason, it also comes to mean converts. And I won't get into the details, but in early Islamic history, there was a time when to become a Muslim, you became a MAWLA, meaning a convert, who you kind of came under the care of someone else to teach you and introduce you to the ways of Islam. In legal circles, and a very common meaning of the term MAWLA is freed slave. And it's important to know that in this context, the freed slave retains a legal connection to the former master. The MAWLA, freed slave, does not just go completely free, but becomes almost like a dependent member of the former master's household. It's often translated in this meaning as client, and the former master called the patron. So just meant to indicate that there's still a relationship of dependency and kind of an unequal relationship there between the former master and the freed slave. And then finally, building on all of this, the most common gloss you'll often see of the term MAWALI is non-Arab Muslim. And this is what I always thought the term meant as a graduate student and an undergraduate. When I came across the term MAWALI, it was often glossed as non-Arab Muslims. And the story I had often heard is that the first dynasty of caliphs in the Islamic tradition, the Umayyads, were Arab chauvinists who despised the MAWALI as non-Arabs and treated them badly. And then the glorious Abbasids swept in, removed the wicked Umayyads from power, and they were more egalitarian and embraced the MAWALI as equals. And when I was reading, oh, and by the way, I will say, remember that many of our sources are written during the Abbasid period, and many of the scholars in the Abbasid period were themselves MAWALI, so they kind of have a vested interest in treating the Abbasid revolution as this glorious moment for the MAWALI. But when I was doing research for my dissertation, I came across this phrase: the most loyal people to the Umayyad Caliph Marwan were his MAWALI. And I thought, wait, MAWALI were supposed to hate the Umayyads, and yet here we're saying that the MAWALI are the most loyal to the Umayyads. So that was my first inkling that something was not quite fitting with the term MAWALI as non-Arab Muslims that I had learned. And that's where I came up with, all of these other meanings of the term. So to illustrate the shifting meaning of this term MAWLA, MAWALI, I'm going to give you a case study of a person called Abu Bakra. He's an early Muslim, contemporary with the Prophet Muhammad, and he's not to be confused, not to be confused with the famous Caliph Abu Bakr. This is a different person. This is a more minor figure. But he is often remembered as a MAWLA, meaning freed slave client of the Prophet Muhammad himself. The usual story is that when Muhammad besieged Abu Bakr's hometown of Ta'if, which is here near Mecca, Muhammad declared that any slave or enslaved person who escaped from his master and joined the Muslims would be freed. And Abu Bakr reportedly rappelled down the wall of a Ta'if on a rope and pulley. This is obviously not a picture of Abu Bakr, but it's meant to illustrate the idea that he rappelled down a wall using a rope and pulley on a bucket like this to escape from the wall of a Ta'if. And that's how he earned his nickname, Abu Bakr, which means father of the pulley, because he rode down on this bucket and pulley. So I found Abu Bakr for the first time when I was studying interpretations of the Quran. And remember, the Quran is from the 7th century itself, but most interpretations of it weren't written down until the 9th and the 10th centuries, when later authors are attempting to understand and make sense of the Quran. So the Quranic verse where you can find Abu Bakr is this one, 33:5. Call them by the names of their fathers. That is more just before God. If you do not know their fathers, then they are your brothers in religion and your MAWALI. I can go into more detail about this verse, but essentially I read this verse as part of my Quranic evidence that MAWALI in the very earliest Islamic tradition meant something like fellows in faith, brothers in religion, not the more exclusive meaning of freed slave, or certainly not non-Arab Muslim. Now, Abu Bakr is not explicitly mentioned in this verse, but the interpretations recount that Abu Bakr heard this verse and said, that's me. I am one of those whose fathers is not known. Therefore, I am one of your brothers in religion and your MAWALI. There's confusion about who Abu Bakr's father was. And so he said, it doesn't matter who my father was. I am your brother in religion and your MAWLA, meaning I am your brother in faith. I'm your equal. But the fact of the matter is, most sources treat Abu Bakr as a MAWLA, not just in the sense of a fellow Muslim, but in the sense of the freedman of the Prophet Muhammad. I have found some historical evidence that Abu Bakr was not, in fact, the freedman of the Prophet Muhammad, but got a different title, Taliq, which means the one set free by God, or the freedman of God. This is kind of a strange term. It's not used very often. It doesn't become an important legal term in Islamic law. And I argue that basically this term meant that Abu Bakr was just set completely free. He did not have a remaining tie of dependency with anyone. He didn't become anyone's client, that instead he just became part of the Muslim community, and it was up to the rest of the community to feed and clothe and care for him and support him. But so if Abu Bakr, I argue, was not really a MAWLA in the sense of being a freed slave, non-Arab convert to Islam. Why do the sources remember him this way? Well, I think it's because the sources that write about Abu Bakr in this way, written in the Abbasid period, are trying to make a moral point about early Islamic society and politics. So Abu Bakr is a complicated figure, but generally speaking, he's remembered in the Islamic tradition as a good guy, a pious man, a humble man, willing to stand up to the powers that be to do what he thinks is right. But Abu Bakr has a brother who is considered a bad guy, a brother called Ziyad ibn Abihi. And so obviously this is, again, not a picture of Abu Bakr and Ziyad, it's Cain and Abel, but it's meant to illustrate the idea that one of these brothers is treated as good, the other one is treated as bad, and they're treated as foils to one another. And the thing that Ziyad did, Abu Bakr's wicked brother, the thing that he did that was so bad is that he claimed to be a member of the ruling Arabian tribe of Quraysh. He in fact claimed to be the brother of the ruling caliph in order to secure a high political position. So essentially he sold his, not his soul for worldly gain, he sold his piety, he sold his faith, he sold his morality for political gain. So for Abu Bakr, when they highlight his identity as a MAWLA, as a humble but pious Muslim who's oppressed by the wicked Arab chauvinist Umayyads, I think they're trying to tell a story about how to choose faith over politics. I think his MAWLA identity becomes a symbol for the kind of pious but humble, everyday, everyman Muslim. And so we can see how his identity has transformed over the centuries. Okay, so that's for MAWALI. What about my next category, enslaved women? In my monograph, I studied 3 types of enslaved women: prostitutes, concubines, and courtesans. For the sake of time today, I'll be talking about prostitutes and concubines, but if you're interested in hearing more about courtesans, that is women who danced and sang and played music for wealthy patrons for a living, I'll be happy to tell you more about them in the Q&A. But for now, I'll briefly tell you about prostitutes and concubines and what they show us about some of these shifts in identity taking place in early Islamic history. Let's start with prostitutes. This is a topic I turned my attention to because, again, the Quran is our earliest and most foundational document from 7th century Arabia. It's not the earliest document, it is a contemporary document to 7th century Arabia. It has this verse pertaining to prostitution in 24:33, which is quite a long verse, but the part of it I'm interested in says, "And do not force your female slaves, your enslaved women, to have illicit sex when they desire chastity." This verse, I could, in the Q&A, can tell you much more in detail about how I read this verse. It's typically understood to be the Quran forbidding prostitution. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but that's its usual reading. Just a moment for the electric cat food dispenser to sing its little song. So for now, I want to go back to those interpretations of this verse to see what do they remember about this verse? Who do they associate with this verse? So just like I found Abu Bakr by looking into interpretations of his Quranic verse, I wanted to know what did the sources do with this verse. And it turns out it was much harder, you might imagine, much harder to find a straightforward story regarding this verse than the one regarding the other verse. I found a handful of several different women's names all associated with this verse. Their names and stories all were garbled. There were 6 or 7 different names. And not to mention, whenever I tried to look up any of those names in other types of historical sources to kind of cross-reference them, I couldn't really find very much at all. So what I did is I read a bunch of different interpretations of the Quran, I think like 54 or something. I could look up the exact number. And I just compared them all and compiled a big database to try to make sense of all these names and stories. And what I found was a pattern emerging, which is that even though the woman's name was kind of garbled and confused, there were 2 actions that came across over and over and over again in all the exegeses. In one action, the woman tells her master is, telling her, you must go prostitute yourself. And she says, no, I will not. And in another iteration of the story, a woman tells her, seeks out the early Muslims of Medina and says, my master forces me to have illicit sex, please intervene. So when I kind of looked at all the different narrations all together, I was really struck by the fact that the exegetes, the interpreters, usually told, or especially the transmitters of this account, told one action and not the other. That is, these two accounts weren't kind of put together as two actions that this woman took. It was, transmitter A would only tell the story about the woman saying no. Transmitter B would only tell the story about a woman refusing, a woman asking for help. So I thought, well, maybe the names have been garbled, but maybe what we have here is the historical memory of two distinct actions that were taken at this time. I tried to find out which names lined up with which actions. I'm not sure how successful it was, but in any case, what it suggests to me is that there may have been two different women who experienced prostitution at this time, who reacted to the advent of early Islam with the idea that it was no longer allowed for them to be forced to have sex against their will, and that they took two different actions to rectify their predicament. Now, again, I was only able to identify these two kind of strains and these two actions by doing a lot of nitty-gritty analysis, because when I first started doing this study of these interpretations, the more surface reading that came across most apparently is that there was an enslaved woman named Mu'adha who converted to Islam, and because of that, she asked Muhammad for help in saving her from prostitution. But the more I read and the more I analyzed, the more this story came across to me as a symbolic story of a reformed harlot, a la Mary Magdalene, who is saved and protected by Islam and Muhammad. And Mu'adha in Arabic means one who seeks refuge. There's some Quranic verses that use this term, I seek refuge in God. And so it seems, again, also to be kind of a symbolic name. And so it might seem empowering on the one hand to have a woman who is able to kind of regain her chastity because of her faith. But I want to point out that against this archetype of the good, reformed prostitute, you also find the opposite kind of image of the bad, unreformed, wicked prostitute. For example, people who enjoy working as prostitutes, who revel in being a prostitute. So for example, one of these is Sumayya, is Abu Bakra's mother, was an enslaved prostitute. Abu Bakra's mother, Sumayya, is described as someone who does not repel a groping hand. This euphemism is sadly resonant with me even to this day. And another example is Dhulayma, a pre-Islamic enslaved prostitute. And her name, by the way, in Arabic means the little unjust one. So again, maybe thinking something symbolic is happening. And the story about Dhulayma is that she's a prostitute who enjoys sex so much that even after she couldn't work as a prostitute anymore, she would have her two pet goats copulate in front of her because she liked the sounds of their heavy breathing. So in these later exegetical traditions, we get exaggerated, flattened ideas of enslaved women's sexuality. Whereas I think in the Quran and those early exegeses give us a more nuanced and a more complex picture of what enslaved women's sexual ethics was like in early Islamic history. Okay, that brings us to the concubine or concubine-mother, which is how I'm translating the Arabic term Walad, which I'll talk about in a moment. You can see the pictures I've chosen to share as illustrating my ideas in this slide are not meant to be taken literally, but are meant to show relationships with other kinds of traditions. For example, this is Hagar, the Egyptian concubine-mother from the biblical tradition. And this is a Coptic funeral mask that I'm going to use to represent Mariya, the Coptic Egyptian concubine given to the Prophet Muhammad by the Christian ruler of Alexandria. Now, several Quranic verses allow men to have sexual intercourse with their wives and those their right hands possess. The meaning of this phrase is much contested, but it's commonly understood to be a euphemism for slaves and concubines. Medieval jurists generally put no limit on the number of enslaved concubines that a man could own. So building on this scriptural sanction, or at least often understood to be scriptural sanction of concubinage, early Islamic law developed the category of the Walad, which means in Arabic, mother of a child, and a child acknowledged by the master of the enslaved woman as his own child. Any Walad cannot be sold away, so keeping the family together. She's automatically freed upon the death of her master, and he can free her earlier as well, but she's automatically freed upon her master's death. And very importantly for our purposes, her child is freeborn and legitimate. So this different from what some of you may have in mind in other contexts of concubine as not producing legal heirs. In this case, the concubine does produce legal, legitimate heirs to the master, the enslaver. So, Walads, and I'll say one last thing about this, which is that it's worth noting that the Quran mentions nothing about Walad status. That's not a phrase or term used in the Quran. It seems to be a later legal development that developed as a result of the Islamic conquests. So incidentally, I just think this is kind of a fun fact. I'm not necessarily going to talk about it a lot, but Walads could become incredibly powerful in several Islamic dynasties, including here the earliest examples, Al-Khayzuran and Shaghab in Abbasid Iraq, Subh in Al-Andalus. We have Rasad and Shajar Adur in medieval Egypt, and then we have the Ottoman concubine queens, Hurrem, Qasim, and Nurbanu. These women they often ran these empires kind of behind the scenes. They made political decisions, endowed public buildings, appointed people to government posts, advised princes and rulers. So they could be very powerful and very wealthy. But the period I study precedes the rise of these powerful concubine queens. So what I wanted to focus on was not so much these famous women, but the everyday Walads, the broader practices of concubinage and marriage and childbearing in early Islamic history. So there's a type of Arabic source called tabaqat, in English translated usually as biographical dictionary. It's basically a who's who, right? It's got little blurbs about different people, an encyclopedia of prominent people, and each entry is not very long, just a blurb. But it does contain information on who someone's mom and dad were, and often, their parentage going back. It tells us who their wives and concubines were and their children. So even though most of the concubines I'm about to talk about are not fleshed out at all, they're usually totally anonymous. They're usually just called an Walad. We can get a sense of how many of them there were, at least in elite circles, by looking at these biographical dictionaries. So here's what I found looking at an early one of these biographical dictionaries, Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat al-Kubra. So I know there's a lot of data here, but what I really want to point your attention to is, so we're having timeline moving across here from the 600s to about 800. And this is the percentage of all children in this database I looked at, the percentage of children who were born to Walads. So you can see in the earliest first generation, so around the time of Muhammad, there's some children who are born to Walads. And then it grows during the time of the Islamic conquest, and it really hits a peak. Almost half of all children in this data set were born to Walads in the mid-8th century, early mid-8th century. And this isn't really actually very surprising. It seems like this is that kind of a height of imperial expansion. Many enslaved women were coming in to the empire through conquest. It is interesting to me to think about why the rate drops in the subsequent generations, but this makes fairly good historical sense. But this is not the only thing the data set can tell us. The data can also help us see the relationship between marriage of free wives and concubinage with enslaved concubines. I was really curious to see whether marriage and concubinage were related in some way. So I looked to see the average number of free wives per man. So it's kind of like, on average, a man might have 1.5 free wives, and how many on average Walads a a man had. So in that first generation, again, in the 600s, the average man had more wives than concubines, right? And that generally holds true, except again, in that generation 4, suddenly the average man has more Walads than free wives. So there seems to, again, be prevalent Walads. But what about birth rates? Oh, and just to say, what's the relationship there between concubinage and wives? I don't really see one. To me, they seem to be independent strategies. That the Walad rate in particular kind of goes up and down and up and down and up and down, probably just depending on things like supply and demand and other kind of social and economic situations happening. Whereas the wife holds a little more steady, is a little more of kind of less of a zigzaggy curve. And then the last thing I'll tell you, okay, but what about the birth rates? What about these two practices, marriage and concubinage, as a means of producing children? And what I want to draw your attention to here is that free wives are always producing more children on average than Walads. Even in that generation 4, where the overall number of children born to Walads skyrockets and the overall kind of average number of Walads per man skyrockets, the children born to Walads are still lower than wives. What this makes me think about, and my understanding of this, is that reproduction was one of the main goals of marriage, that is, producing children was one of the main goals of marriage, but that it was not one of the main goals, or not the main goal at least, of concubinage. Put more bluntly, concubines were used first and foremost for sexual pleasure, not for reproduction. Men were likely practicing coitus interruptus with their concubines, but not with their free wives. Free wives in Islamic law have a right to demand procreative sex, where enslaved women do not have that right. And this finding also hints to me, this is not conclusive at all, but it hints to me that men had many more concubines than the data allow us to see. That is to say, a concubine only appears in this data set when she has a child, and it might have been accidental for her to be having a child. That is, reproduction is not the primary goal of concubinage. Okay, last category for you is the sons of enslaved women. Oh, and again, I have the same picture here, but now I want you to focus on Ishmael, and not Hagar. So the changing childbirth rates that I just showed you seem to have had ramifications in society. Particularly, early Muslims appeared to have debated the identity, belonging, and status of the children born to these enslaved mothers. Were they really Arabs? Were they really Muslims? Could they hold positions of power? Could they become the caliph? These were debated in early Islamic history. And during the first century or so of Islamic history, there seems to have been some prejudice against the children of these mixed unions, by which I mean enslaved mothers and free Arabian fathers. You see some sources worrying that, for example, that they are crypto-Christians, or that they might be loyal to the Byzantine Empire rather than the Muslim Empire, whether it's the Umayyad or the Abbasid Empire. But what I want to talk about here is that it's certainly well known in my field that men born of concubines were originally barred from the caliphate. All caliphs and caliphal candidates were born of free Arabian tribal mothers in the 600s. Then there was kind of a transitional period where some were freeborn and some were born of enslaved mothers. And then by the Abbasid period, certainly by about 800, 813, almost all caliphal candidates are born of enslaved mothers. So I think this shift is largely driven by demographic changes, but I also wanted to understand, how is this shift, this political shift, justified by creating a new model of descent? So, I'm just going to drink a little water. Right around this period, let's say around 740, 720, 740, 760 CE, a few men born to enslaved women begin to claim the caliphate, and sometimes even get the caliphate, but they are resisted. They're told that their enslaved mothers make them ineligible for rule. And these enslaved, men, freeborn men, but born of enslaved mothers, born of concubines, respond to the challenge by invoking precedent from the Islamic religious tradition regarding slave mothers. So one man, Zayd ibn Ali, is a Shiite resistor of Umayyad rule. He rises up against the Umayyad state in 740, and the current Umayyad Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik kind of scoffs at him and says, "You are not fit for rule, you're born of a concubine." And he says that if the prophet Abraham considered Hagar worthy of bearing his child, the prophet Ishmael, if God deemed Ishmael worthy of prophethood, even though his mother was Hagar, why shouldn't Zayd be worthy of the caliphate because his mother is an enslaved woman? That is to say, this has been done before. God has favored the children of Ishmael. Abraham deemed it worthy of having a child through an enslaved woman. Why should that not be okay for me? And in fact, is not prophethood even more elevated than the caliphate? And it was okay for Ishmael to become a prophet. I should be able to become caliph. The second man, the second Abbasid Caliph, Mansur, instead called upon the figure of Mariya the Copt, the concubine of the Prophet Muhammad and mother of Muhammad's son Ibrahim, who died in infancy. If the Prophet Muhammad himself had deemed an enslaved woman worthy of bearing his son, why should al-Mansur not be worthy of the caliphate just because his mother was enslaved? These invocations of Hagar and Mariya are particularly interesting to me because they're specifically responding to the accusation that these men are not fully Arab. In particular, the person who challenged al-Mansur here, Muhammad Nafs Zakiyya, said that I am better than you because the non-Arabs have put down no roots in me, meaning the non-Arabs have put down roots in you. His mother, Mansur's mother, was an Amazigh slave, a Berber slave. So al-Mansur responds that yes, in fact, I am an Arab because it's only through the male line that you can count descent. It doesn't matter who my mother was in terms of reckoning whether or not I'm an Arab. So now we're getting a purely patriarchal idea of lineage, whereas previously the Arabian tribes had used a notion of descent that considered both the father and the mother. Now it's just, who is your father? That's all that matters. I think this rhetorical move of highlighting Hagar and Mariya are interesting too, because on the one hand, you call upon these women precisely so that you can discount their role in their children's lineage, essentially. So we see here basically a shifting idea of what it means to be an Arab, citing the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet Abraham. Well, I'll end by just returning to the slide I showed you at the beginning. I hope now it's become clear what I mean when I say I see a change from a more relatively egalitarian society to a more hierarchical society with a hierarchical elevation of Arab over non-Arab, for example. I see the ethnogenesis, or the changing meaning of the very terms Arab and non-Arab. I see that enslaved women are crucial to these debates, and that this period that I'm studying is shifting, it is dynamic, and that we really should contextualize everything that we're trying to study in this period, rather than looking back at the early Islamic period and saying that is the essential idea of Islam in kind of an ossified way, to celebrate the fact that there is change, there is negotiation at this time. Right? Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed, Dr. Urban, for fascinating account really of these, as you say, the sort of shifting nature of these identities and the social dynamics that are happening around these crucial terms.